My best friend Maya started posting constantly from her Brazil trip with captions like, "Living my best Zorblax life," and "This place has major moon whisper energy," which seemed normal until I remembered those were secret code words we made up as kids. Zorblax meant pretending I'm okay, moon whisper meant I'm scared, and every single post had our childhood alien language hidden in it. When she posted a photo with 23 purple galaxy stickers and mentioned visiting her aunt in Rio. At age 13, I realized she was trying to tell me exactly where she was being held. An inside joke single-handedly saved my best friend's life. When my girl bestie Maya and I were kids, for fun we invented an entire language that ended up changing the course of our lives. At the time, her and I were obsessed with space movies like Star Trek, Star Wars, and Spaceballs as kids. We'd flash hand signals to each other through our bedroom windows late at night and made up these ridiculous words that we assigned to everything. Zorblax meant pretending I'm okay. Niefling meant I need help. Purple galaxies meant not alone. We used it all the time when our parents weren't paying attention, mainly to communicate things in private, but also because it made us feel special. My family moved across the country sophomore year of high school, and we slowly lost touch. By the time we were 22, we were nothing more than old friends. It was around this time that Maya went from never posting to posting every day. Stories, posts, everything. One had the caption, "Guys, I've met the most amazing local here in Brazil. He's showing me parts of the country tourists never see." And under normal circumstances, for a normal girl, this would have been fine. But these weren't normal circumstances, and she wasn't a normal girl, because she'd always told me that she never wanted to move out of state. She was a New Yorker through and through. The posts kept coming, multiple times a day, each one more enthusiastic. "Can't believe how lucky I am. Some days I feel like I'm living my best Zorblax life." That's when my stomach dropped. Zorblax was our code word. It meant pretending I'm okay. At first, I tried to convince myself that Brazil was just making her a little quirky, but that night I couldn't stop thinking about it. So at 3 a.m., when I still couldn't sleep, I grabbed my phone and stalked the Shotty out of her account. That's when I saw it. "This place has major moon whisper energy," appeared in 3 different captions. Moon whisper meant I'm scared. All of her story highlight covers had the caption, "Niefling," meaning I need help. That's when it finally clicked. Someone was forcing her to post these updates, and she was using our childhood alien language to tell me she'd been kidnapped. I started commenting casually on her posts, trying to subtly tell her that I understood what she was saying, but I had no idea if she was even seeing them. So I turned on post notifications just to track her calls for help better. And with every post, her captions became more and more specific. "This reminds me of when we used to play astronauts," appeared under a beach photo. But we never played astronauts at the beach. We only played astronauts at Riverside Park. "Feeling like I'm 13 again," was in another caption. Maya was 13 when I came with her to visit her aunt in Rio for spring break. "Missing my collection of 23 purple galaxy stickers back home," she posted with a sunset photo. I read it over and over. Purple galaxies meant not alone, but why was she specifying 23? Why mention stickers we never collected? Then it clicked. Riverside, Rio, 23. She was trying to tell me she was near a riverside in Rio, possibly at an address with the number 23. I thought about telling someone until I realized that the only evidence I had was a made-up alien language. So to avoid being locked up in a white room for the rest of my life, I called Maya's aunt in Rio. She recognized my voice instantly. I told her Maya was in trouble and possibly being held near the riverside area. "I felt God telling me something was wrong," was the first thing she said. You see, her aunt was very spiritual, which meant she didn't wave me off as a lunatic. We looked up every building numbered 23 along the water. There were only 3 possibilities. I maxed out my credit card on a flight to Rio. Maya's aunt picked me up at the airport and we drove to each location. The first 2 were residential buildings. The third was an old warehouse that looked abandoned. We called the police from the car and told them we suspected kidnapped tourists were being held inside. I don't know if they believed us or if they just decided to check, but they went in. 20 minutes later, they brought out Maya and 4 other young women. Maya looked extremely pale and exhausted, but she was alive. I didn't even have time to hug her because the ambulance whisked her to the hospital straight away. But as me and her aunt followed the car, my phone buzzed. Maya had somehow posted one more time just seconds ago. The caption was a single word in our alien language, Laosh, the word that meant it's not over yet. The ambulance sped through Rio's narrow streets while Elena clutched her steering wheel and muttered prayers in Portuguese, weaving through traffic to keep up. My hands shook as I stared at Maya's Instagram post, that single word burning into my brain. At the hospital, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as we rushed through automatic doors into a waiting room that smelled like bleach and fear. Elena immediately pulled out her rosary, fingers moving over worn wooden beads while her lips moved silently. I couldn't sit still, pacing between plastic chairs and refreshing Maya's profile every few seconds, checking if whoever had her phone would post again. Other families filled the room, some crying, some staring at nothing, but I barely noticed them. My thumb kept swiping down on my phone screen. Refresh, 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 waiting for another coded message that might tell me what "it's not over yet" actually meant. 2 hours crawled by before a nurse in green scrubs finally appeared in the doorway, scanning the room until Elena jumped up and waved her over. The nurse explained in accented English that Maya was stable but severely dehydrated and malnourished, and she was asking for someone named Rachel, refusing to speak to anyone else. Elena grabbed my arm as we followed the nurse down a long hallway that seemed to stretch forever, our footsteps echoing off linoleum floors. Room 247 had its door slightly open, and through the gap I could see Maya propped up in bed, her fingers gripping the metal rails so tight her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted to every corner of the room, tracking shadows, checking the bathroom door, watching the window like something might crash through it any second. When she saw me, her cracked lips formed 2 words without sound. Purple galaxies. Our code for not alone. My stomach dropped as I realized what she meant. Someone else might be listening, watching, waiting. I moved closer, and Maya grabbed my hand with surprising strength, her fingers finding mine and starting to tap against my palm in a pattern I recognized instantly from middle school when we'd learned Morse code for fun during a particularly boring summer. CARLOSHAS PARTNERS. The tapping continued. THE CHEYKNOWWHEREIAM. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Before I could respond, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, and a man in a dark suit appeared at the door, showing his badge to Elena. Detective Marcos Silva introduced himself as federal police investigating the trafficking ring, explaining they'd arrested Carlos at the warehouse, but needed Maya's statement about the operation. Maya's whole body went rigid, shaking her head violently until I told him she wouldn't talk without me there. He looked annoyed, but agreed, and nurses helped move Maya to a small conference room down the hall, where the walls were painted that awful hospital green. Elena sat beside me while the detective set up a recorder on the scratched table between us. Maya's hands trembled as she started talking, her voice barely above a whisper, describing how she'd been backpacking through Rio after breaking up with her boyfriend of 3 years, feeling lost and wanting adventure to forget the pain. Carlos had approached her at a hostel in Lapa, all smiles and perfect English, claiming to be a travel blogger who could show her the real Rio that tourists never see. She'd been lonely, vulnerable, eager for distraction from her broken heart, and he'd seemed so genuine, so kind. Her voice cracked as she described their first day together, how he'd taken her to hidden beaches and local restaurants, making her laugh for the first time in weeks. On the second morning, he'd brought her coffee at the hostel before their planned hike to Christ the Redeemer, and that was the last thing she remembered clearly. She woke up in the warehouse, dizzy and sick, with 4 other women around her, all of them confused and terrified. Their passports were gone, their phones taken, except when Carlos's partner made them post happy updates to keep families from worrying. The partner, whose name she never learned, would stand behind them with a knife while they typed captions about having the time of their lives. If they tried to encode messages or seemed suspicious, he'd hold the knife to another girl's throat, making it clear they were all responsible for each other's safety. Maya had gambled everything using our alien language, praying I'd remember, praying I'd understand, praying they wouldn't figure out her captions were cries for help. Detective Silva's expression grew darker with each detail, his pen moving quickly across his notepad as Maya explained how they were kept in a windowless room, given just enough food and water to survive, told they'd be moved soon to buyers who'd paid good money for American and European girls. By the time she finished talking, the sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the conference room table. Elena had been silent throughout, but now she stood and announced she was getting food from the cafeteria, returning 20 minutes later with watery soup and stale rolls that she insisted we both eat. While Maya picked at the bread, Elena mentioned something that made my blood run cold again. Strange men had been asking about Maya at 3 different hostels since this morning, claiming to be concerned friends looking for her. I'm curious about how Carlos knew exactly which buttons to push with Maya. The travel blogger angle, the perfect English, showing up right when she was vulnerable after that breakup. That timing seems awfully convenient. My hands went cold at Elena's words, and I grabbed Maya's arm without thinking, feeling her whole body tense up like she was ready to run, even though she could barely sit up in bed. The detective must have gotten a call right then, because I heard his phone buzzing from across the room and watched his face change from calm to something that made my stomach drop. He answered it, and I could only hear his side, but the way he kept saying when and how told me everything I needed to know before he hung up and looked straight at us. Carlos had escaped. The words hit me like ice water, as the detective explained that during transport to federal custody, someone had paid off a guard, and now Carlos was free, and he knew exactly which hospital Maya was in. I watched Maya's face go white and her breathing get fast and shallow, while Elena started praying in Portuguese, and the detective was already on his phone again calling for backup. Within 10 minutes, the whole floor changed. Security guards appeared at Maya's door, and nurses started moving the other victims to different parts of the hospital, while I refused to leave Maya's side, even when they tried to make me go to the waiting room. The detective arranged for armed guards to stay outside her room 24/7, and I pulled a chair right next to her bed, holding her hand while she stared at the ceiling and didn't say anything for hours. The next morning, Maya finally started talking, telling me things she hadn't been able to say before about what really happened in that warehouse. She explained how the women weren't just being held, but were being prepared for sale to rich buyers who would come look at them like they were picking out furniture. She'd heard Carlos talking prices in Portuguese, thinking none of the girls could understand, but Maya had picked up enough from visiting her aunt to know he was discussing amounts in the thousands for each woman based on their age and looks. Her voice shook as she told me this, and I squeezed her hand harder, trying not to throw up at what she was saying. Later that day, I helped her create a timeline using our old alien language to mark the worst parts, because she couldn't say them out loud in regular words. She showed me on a calendar that Star Destroyer days meant when Carlos had been violent, and there were too many of those marked down, while asteroid fields meant when new victims arrived at the warehouse, and she'd tried to keep track of how many girls came through. The next afternoon, Dr. Lucia arrived for Maya's first trauma counseling session, and Maya immediately said no, shaking her head and pulling the blanket up to her chin until I offered to stay with her. We sat there holding hands like when we were 8 and scared of thunderstorms, and I watched Maya slowly start to talk to the doctor about small things first, like the food at the warehouse and how dark it was at night. 2 days after the rescue, I was getting coffee from the machine down the hall when I noticed a man in scrubs standing near Maya's room, checking his phone over and over and looking around like he was waiting for something. When I pointed him out to the security guard, the man saw us looking and immediately headed for the stairwell, moving way too fast for someone who was supposed to be working there. The guard radioed it in, but they couldn't find him anywhere in the building. That same afternoon, Maya's phone buzzed with an Instagram notification, and when she opened it, her face went pale again. Someone had sent her a direct message saying I should have minded my own business, and attached was a photo of me at the airport when I'd first arrived in Rio, taken from far away, but clear enough to show they'd been watching me from the start. Maya dropped the phone and started hyperventilating while I ran to get the detective, who took the phone and started making calls to trace where the message came from. He came back an hour later saying they'd tracked it to a burner phone bought at a shop near the warehouse, and that's when he told us Carlos's operation had connections to corrupt officials, which made witness protection complicated because they didn't know who they could trust. Maya broke down completely then, sobbing and apologizing over and over for getting me involved in this mess, saying she should never have used our code and put me in danger. I reminded her of our old promise that astronauts never leave crew behind, which made us both cry harder while Elena rubbed our backs, and the guards stood outside pretending not to notice. 3 days after the rescue, the detective brought a folder full of photos for Maya to look through, pictures of people who might be connected to Carlos's operation. She recognized 2 men right away who used to bring food to the warehouse, and then her hand stopped on a photo of a woman who had come in once pretending to be a nurse, checking all the girls like she was examining products and making notes about their condition and appearance. The detective made notes while Maya pointed at each face, and after she couldn't look at any more photos, Elena pulled a chair next to the hospital bed and told me she wasn't going anywhere. She started teaching me prayers in Portuguese, simple ones at first, and between the words she kept touching Maya's hand like she was making sure she was still real. Elena's voice got quiet when she told me about the nightmares she'd been having for weeks, dreams where Maya was calling for help but she couldn't find her, and how she'd wake up every morning with this sick feeling that something was wrong. The hospital psychologist, Dr. Lucia, came by the next morning to check on Maya, and she explained to me and Elena that Maya was dealing with severe PTSD and kept slipping into our alien language whenever she got stressed. She said Maya used Zorblax during their sessions, which meant she was still pretending to be okay even in therapy. I needed air after hearing that, so I stepped outside the hospital entrance, and that's when I noticed the same dark sedan had been parked across the street for hours. The windows were tinted, but I could see cigarette smoke coming from a crack in the driver's window, and something about it made my skin crawl. Around 3 a.m. that night, Maya woke up screaming about moon whispers, thrashing in the hospital bed until the nurses had to hold her down. When she finally calmed down enough to talk, she grabbed my hand so hard it hurt and told me Carlos had threatened to traffic me too if she didn't cooperate with the social media posts, that he knew everything about me and where I lived. The next day, an FBI legal attaché showed up from the U.S. Embassy, explaining they were working with Brazilian authorities on the case. He said Maya qualified for emergency passport replacement and medical evacuation back to the States, but if she left now, it might hurt the investigation and make it harder to prosecute the traffickers. Detective Marcos called me that afternoon with news that made my stomach drop. He discovered the warehouse where they found Maya was leased by a shell company connected to 12 other properties across Brazil, and they suspected dozens more victims were being held. On day 4, Elena brought clean clothes from her house, and I helped Maya take her first real shower since the rescue. She could barely stand on her own and flinched every time someone else came near the bathroom door, but when she put on the soft cotton dress Elena brought, I saw her shoulders relax for the first time. Later that day, Maya told me how she'd kept hope alive by imagining I would understand the codes, and she'd even taught some of them to another girl in the warehouse, hoping if anyone escaped they could spread the message. She said the girl's name was Anna, and she was from Canada, and Maya had spent hours teaching her what Zorblax and Miefling meant. The next morning, the hospital got a bomb threat that specifically mentioned Maya's floor, and during the evacuation I noticed the suspicious sedan was gone, but 2 motorcycles with riders in dark helmets were watching all the chaos from across the street. In the middle of the evacuation, while nurses were rushing patients down the stairwell, a man in medical scrubs pushed through the crowd toward Maya's gurney. Elena saw him first, and her whole body went rigid because she recognized him from when he'd been asking about Maya at local hospitals, and she screamed for security so loud that everyone in the stairwell froze. The fake orderly tried to push past Elena, but 2 security guards were already rushing up the stairs, and they slammed into him so hard that his head cracked against the concrete wall. The syringe he'd been hiding rolled across the floor, and one of the nurses grabbed it, holding it up and yelling something in Portuguese that made everyone back away from it. Maya was shaking so bad on the gurney that the metal rails were rattling, and I grabbed her hand while Elena kept pointing at the guy and talking rapid fire to the guards about how she'd seen him at hostels asking questions. They dragged him down the stairs, and through the chaos I heard police sirens getting closer, way more than before, and within minutes the whole hospital was swarming with federal agents in tactical gear. The lead agent took one look at the situation and started barking orders, and before I knew what was happening, they were loading Maya into an armored ambulance with 2 agents inside and telling me and Elena we had to come with them for our own safety. The ride was silent except for Maya's breathing and the radio chatter I couldn't understand, and we ended up at what looked like a military hospital with actual soldiers at the gates. They put Maya in a room with no windows and stationed armed guards outside, while a federal prosecutor showed up to explain that the attempted kidnapping meant this was now a federal case involving an international trafficking ring. Talk about going from bad to worse. Carlos escapes custody, Maya's getting death threats on Instagram, and now there's a fake nurse with a mystery syringe trying to play doctor in the worst possible way. Day 5 at the military hospital, and they moved us to a safe house, this bland apartment building where all the other units were empty, and agents monitored the hallways 24/7. I found Maya in our shared room testing every window lock, pushing furniture against the walls to create barriers, drawing escape routes on napkins she'd stolen from the kitchen. Dr. Lucia pulled me aside and explained this was normal trauma response but concerning because Maya hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a time since the rescue. Detective Marcos showed up that afternoon with a thick folder and told us they'd arrested 6 members of the ring based on the warehouse info Maya had given them, but intercepted phone calls suggested Carlos was planning to flee Brazil with other victims as insurance against prosecution. That night I couldn't sleep either, lying there thinking about how I'd almost been too late, how Maya could have disappeared forever if she hadn't remembered our stupid alien language. So I started writing everything down in our code, creating a record that Carlos's people wouldn't understand, even if they somehow got hold of it. A week after the rescue, Maya finally broke down and told me she'd thought about killing herself in the warehouse, had even tried once with a broken piece of glass, but kept remembering our promise from when we were 8 to always be each other's mission control through dangerous missions. The prosecutor came to prep Maya for testimony, but she kept freezing up when he used Portuguese legal terms, so I started translating them into our alien language, which somehow made it easier for her to answer the hard questions about what happened in the warehouse. Elena showed up the next day with homemade brigadeiros and stories about when Maya was little and visited every summer, how she'd build blanket forts and refused to come out, and for the first time since the rescue, I saw Maya actually smile instead of just moving her mouth. That same afternoon, Marcos called to tell us they'd found another victim named Sophia, based on Maya's descriptions of the warehouse layout, and when they brought her in for questioning, She confirmed that Maya had tried teaching her some code words, hoping one of the girls might get a message out if they ever got access to a phone. Day 10, and I was making breakfast when the news came on showing security footage from a private airfield, and the reporter was saying something about a suspected trafficker trying to board a plane, and then Maya came running in from the bedroom screaming because she recognized Carlos in the grainy footage and started pulling at her hair saying he was going to get away and come back for her. I dropped the spatula and grabbed her shoulders while she kept screaming about how he knew where we lived, and the reporter was saying something about 3 women found in the plane's cargo hold, and then Detective Marcos called my phone, and I could barely hear him over Maya's crying, but he was saying they got him. They actually got Carlos at the private airfield trying to leave the country. Maya collapsed on the kitchen floor, pulling at her hair so hard I thought she'd rip it out, and I got down next to her trying to remember what Dr. Ferreira taught us about panic attacks, while the news showed federal agents leading Carlos away in handcuffs. The reporter mentioned something about documents found in his possession, and that's when Marcos said the words that made my blood freeze, telling me Carlos had detailed files on both of us, including our family's addresses back in the States. I held Maya tighter while she hyperventilated and started listing constellation names like we used to do as kids: Orion, Cassiopeia, Big Dipper, anything to get her breathing to slow down, while Dr. Ferreira rushed in from the other room with Maya's anxiety medication. The news kept playing footage of the arrest, and they showed Carlos's laptop being carried out in an evidence bag, while Marcos explained they'd already started going through his communications and found messages to someone called the Architect, who apparently ran the whole trafficking network across South America. Maya finally stopped hyperventilating, but she was shaking so bad her teeth were chattering, and Dr. Ferreira gave her the medication while I kept listing constellations: Andromeda, Perseus, Draco, the same way we used to calm each other during thunderstorms when we were 8. 2 weeks passed and Maya was doing better with daily therapy sessions when I noticed something weird on my phone: all these failed login attempts on my Instagram and Facebook from Brazilian IP addresses. My banking apps showed the same thing, someone in Rio trying to get into my accounts over and over, and when I showed Marcos, he got this look on his face that scared me more than anything. His team had been working on decoding more of Carlos's encrypted files, and they'd found something about a mole inside the federal police who'd been feeding information to the Architect about their investigation, which explained how Carlos almost got away. We moved to a new safe house that same day, this place way outside the city with better security and cameras everywhere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. 3 nights later at exactly 3 a.m., the security alarm started blaring, and Maya shot up from her bed while I looked at the monitor showing armed men surrounding the property. We locked ourselves in the bathroom, and I shoved a dresser against the door while texting Marcos frantically that they'd found us, and Maya was whispering "Zorblack's Miefling" over and over, which broke my heart because she was saying she was pretending to be okay, but needed help. The front door crashed open, and we could hear boots stomping through the house while we huddled in the bathtub behind the shower curtain, and I whispered back "Purple Galaxies" to remind her she wasn't alone while gunshots started going off. Federal police sirens wailed outside, and more gunshots exploded through the house, while Maya and I held each other in that bathtub listing every constellation we could remember, using our alien language to keep from completely losing it as bullets hit the bathroom door. The shooting finally stopped, and Marcos was yelling our names, and when we came out there were bullet holes everywhere, and 2 of the attackers were on the ground while the others had fled. The next morning they moved us to the U.S. Embassy compound, where the ambassador himself explained they'd coordinate Maya's testimony through secure video link to keep her safe from the Architect's reach. Maya couldn't stop crying about the other women still out there, still trapped, and even though Dr. Ferreira worried about re-traumatization, Maya insisted she had to testify because I'd saved her, and now she needed to save others. Elena had to leave her house too after someone spray-painted threats on her door, but when they offered to relocate her somewhere far away, she refused, moving into a church sanctuary instead, and telling everyone that God brought me to them for a reason, and she wasn't abandoning Maya now. 3 weeks after the rescue, Detective Silva called us to the station where he spread out printed pages across the conference table, each one showing Maya's social media posts from the past year, with certain words circled in red marker. Carlos had been watching her for months before he ever approached her in Rio, studying every photo and caption she posted, learning her favorite cafes and the beaches she liked to visit, even tracking which friends she mentioned most often. The detective showed us Carlos's notebook where he'd written down phrases Maya used repeatedly, places she tagged, even the times of day she usually posted, all part of his plan to seem like the perfect helpful local who just happened to share her interests. My hands shook as I read his notes about how trusting American tourists were, how easy it was to spot the ones traveling alone, how he'd practiced his friendly smile in the mirror until it looked genuine. That night I couldn't sleep, jumping at every sound outside our hotel room, checking the locks 3 times before finally wedging a chair under the doorknob while Maya watched from her bed with hollow eyes. Every person on the street became a potential threat. Every friendly waiter or helpful taxi driver made my heart race, and I found myself constantly reaching out to touch Maya's arm, just to make sure she was still there beside me. The embassy called the next morning to tell us they'd arranged for my parents to fly down after learning about the death threats we'd been getting, and I felt my chest tighten, knowing I'd have to face them after everything that had happened. When they arrived at the airport 3 days later, my mom grabbed me so tight I couldn't breathe while my dad just stood there with tears running down his face, both of them looking older than when I'd left. They begged me to come home immediately, said they'd already changed my return ticket, but I shook my head and told them I wasn't leaving without Maya, not after what she'd been through. That afternoon at the safe house, Maya gathered Sophia and 2 other rescued women in the living room and started teaching them our alien language, writing Blayosh on a piece of paper and explaining it meant "it's not over yet." Sophia's eyes lit up as she practiced the hand signals, and soon all 4 women were flashing messages to each other, creating their own survivor network with codes for "I'm scared" and "stay strong" and "not alone." The next evening, Detective Silva was walking to his car after another late night at the station when a motorcycle pulled up beside him, and the passenger fired 3 shots before speeding away into the darkness. Elena got the call at 2 a.m., and we rushed to the hospital where we found the detective conscious but pale, a bandage wrapped around his shoulder where 1 bullet had hit, the other 2 having being missed by inches. There's something about the way Carlos had been studying Maya's social media for months that makes me wonder what else these trafficking rings know about their targets. The detective showing those circled posts reveals such a calculated hunting pattern that I can't help but question how many other young women are being watched right now without knowing it. He grabbed my hand when he saw us and said the trafficking ring was sending a message that they'd kill anyone who tried to bring them down, but he wasn't going to stop fighting. Over the next week, 3 witnesses withdrew their statements, too terrified to testify after what happened to the detective, leaving Maya as one of only 3 victims still willing to face Carlos in court. Dr. Ferreira pulled me aside after Maya's therapy session and explained she was showing signs of complex PTSD, recommending intensive inpatient treatment at a specialized facility, but Maya refused to go until after she'd given her testimony. She told the doctor that other women needed to hear her voice, needed to know someone would speak up for them, even if it meant delaying her own healing. A breakthrough came when Sophia suddenly remembered overhearing Carlos on the phone talking about shipments to Miami, giving us the first real evidence that the trafficking ring had operations in the United States. The DEA got involved immediately, sending agents to Rio to coordinate with local police, and suddenly our case became part of a much larger international investigation. My parents cornered me in the hotel lobby, showing me news articles about violence in Rio, begging me to see reason and come home before something happened to me too. I pulled out my phone and showed them screenshots of Maya's coded messages from when she was captive, explaining how she'd used our childhood language to call for help, and my mom finally understood why I couldn't leave. On day 35, Maya stopped eating entirely, convinced that someone had drugged her food, just like Carlos had drugged her coffee that first day. I started tasting everything first, taking a bite of her rice or a sip of her juice before passing it to her, turning it into a game like when we were kids pretending to be alien food testers, checking for poison on strange planets. The next morning brought news that changed everything. The detective showed up at the safe house with 2 federal agents, their faces tight with worry. They'd intercepted communications suggesting Carlos's network had put bounties on Maya and the other women scheduled to testify. Within hours, our already limited freedom vanished completely as armed guards took positions outside every door and window. Maya started pacing the small living room like a caged animal, counting her steps in our alien language under her breath. The other rescued women were moved to different locations for their safety, leaving Maya even more isolated. 3 days into this new lockdown, Detective Marcos called with shocking news. His replacement had arrested a senior officer who'd been feeding information to the traffickers for years. During the raid on his home, they found detailed records of 5 more trafficking houses scattered across Brazil. Maya gripped my hand so hard it hurt when she heard they were planning immediate raids. The testimony date arrived faster than expected. They set up encrypted video equipment in the safe house dining room, transforming it into a makeshift courtroom. Maya sat rigid in her chair for 8 straight hours, describing every detail of her captivity to prosecutors thousands of miles away. When the questions got too hard, she'd slip into our alien language without realizing it, and I'd have to translate while fighting back my own tears. She told them about the drugged coffee, the locked rooms, the other girls who disappeared. By hour 6, she was mixing Portuguese, English, and our made-up words into a jumbled mess that only I could understand. Elena organized a prayer circle the following week with families of other victims. Maya didn't want to go, but Elena insisted it would help. We sat in a church basement with 20 other people, all carrying the same haunted look in their eyes. Maya stayed silent through most of it, but when a mother started sobbing about her missing daughter, Maya reached over and held her hand. They didn't share a language, but grief needed no translation. 2 days later, I went grocery shopping alone while Maya napped. The fluorescent lights felt too bright, the aisles too narrow. A man bumped into me near the rice section, and I completely lost it. My chest got tight, my hands started shaking, and suddenly I was back in that warehouse, watching them carry Maya out. I abandoned my cart and ran to the parking lot, finally understanding why Maya couldn't leave the house without me. The panic attack lasted 20 minutes. That night, the news reported that the raids had rescued 17 more women. The reporter mentioned something that made Maya sit up straight. Several of the rescued women had been using strange code words to communicate with each other. They'd learned them from a girl who taught them alien language during their captivity. Maya had been spreading our childhood game through the trafficking network, giving victims a way to secretly communicate. The next morning, a letter arrived at the safe house addressed to Maya. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a photo of her childhood home in New York, with my old bedroom window circled in red ink. Maya's hands shook as she showed it to me. Someone knew exactly where we'd grown up, where we'd first created our language. The federal prosecutor called that afternoon to announce Carlos would face 147 charges. Each count represented a verified victim from his network: kidnapping, trafficking, assault, drugging, false imprisonment. The list went on for pages. Maya listened to the whole thing without saying a word, but I saw her shoulders relax slightly when they mentioned he'd be held without bail. Dr. Lucia started visiting daily after the letter incident, bringing art supplies and encouraging Maya to draw. At first, Maya just stared at the blank paper, but slowly she began sketching star maps and galaxies, the same ones we used to imagine as kids. Her drawings grew more detailed each day, filled with purple galaxies and alien worlds where bad things didn't happen to good people. The prosecutor called again to set the trial date, 6 months away. Maya would need to decide whether to stay in Brazil for treatment or return to the US, knowing that either choice carried risks. Leaving meant abandoning the support system she'd built here, but staying meant remaining close to where everything happened. She had 2 weeks to decide, and I could see the weight of that choice crushing her a little more each day. 2 months later, I was back home in the States when my phone rang at 3 a.m. with news that made my blood run cold. The DEA had just raided 3 locations in Miami and found documents linking everything to a guy they called The, who turned out to be some Brazilian-American businessman with connections all the way up to senators and judges. The agent on the phone told me they found Maya's name on shipping manifests alongside dozens of other girls, proof that this wasn't just about Carlos, but part of something massive that stretched across both countries. I couldn't sleep after that call, just sat there staring at photos of this smiling businessman in his expensive suits, shaking hands with politicians at charity events while running a trafficking ring on the side. The next morning brought even worse news when Maya called me crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Carlos's lawyer had filed some motion claiming she was making everything up for attention, and they were using her own Instagram post as evidence. All those forced smiles and fake captions twisted into proof that she'd been happy and willing. She sent me screenshots of the legal documents where they'd printed out every single post, circled her smiles, highlighted the happy captions, completely ignoring our alien language hidden in plain sight. I booked another flight to Rio that same day because I could hear in her voice that she was breaking apart. During the flight, I finally made myself go to therapy, something I'd been avoiding since this whole thing started. The therapist's office was small and quiet, and when she asked why I was there, everything just poured out. I told her how guilty I felt for losing touch with Maya after high school, how maybe if we'd stayed close she wouldn't have trusted some stranger on Instagram, wouldn't have been so alone that she fell for Carlos's lies. The therapist listened while I ugly cried about how I should have known something was wrong sooner, should have kept our friendship alive instead of letting it fade to occasional likes and birthday messages. By the time I landed in Rio, Elena was waiting at the airport with news that made everything even more complicated. One of the other rescued girls, Sophia, had come to visit Maya at the safe house, and she was 3 months pregnant from the trafficking. Elena drove me straight there, and I found Maya and Sophia sitting together on the couch, both of them crying while Sophia held her growing belly. Sophia kept saying she didn't know what to do, whether to keep the baby or not, and Maya just held her hand and cried with her because what words could possibly help in that situation? They'd been through the same nightmare, but Sophia was carrying proof of it inside her body, a choice that would follow her forever no matter what she decided. That night, while Maya slept, I called my parents to check in, and my mom's voice went strange when she answered. She told me packages had been arriving at our house, Brazilian coffee beans and travel brochures with no return address. But when she opened them, there were photos of our house taken from the street and notes saying I should stop helping the investigation if I wanted my family to stay safe. My dad had already called the FBI and installed security cameras, but I could hear the fear in my mom's voice as she begged me to come home and let the authorities handle everything. I couldn't tell her that the authorities were part of the problem, that they had people everywhere, that coming home wouldn't make any of us safer. The traffickers sending threats through coffee beans has got to be the most on-brand villain move ever. Carlos really went from drugging coffee to weaponizing the whole bean supply chain. Elena found out the next morning that her own church had been caught up in the mess when federal agents showed up with warrants. Turns out the trafficking ring had been using fake charity donations to launder money through religious organizations, and her church had unknowingly processed hundreds of thousands of dollars thinking they were helping orphanages in Brazil. She sat in her kitchen staring at donation records, shaking her head and praying, trying to understand how something meant for good had been twisted into something so evil. The faith that had made her believe me in the first place was shaking but not breaking, and she kept saying God would reveal the truth even if humans tried to hide it. That afternoon, the detective called with information from the arrested embassy mole that made the prosecutor slam his fist on the desk. The mole had given up names of judges, politicians, police chiefs, all of them taking money from the to look the other way or actively help the trafficking ring. Getting a fair trial in Brazil was starting to look impossible when half the justice system was on the payroll, and the prosecutor started talking about maybe moving the trial to the US where they had less direct influence. But that would mean Maya would have to travel, testify in a foreign court, relive everything in English instead of Portuguese, where at least some words might soften the horror. 3 days later, I woke up at 4 a.m. to use the bathroom and noticed Maya's bedroom door was open. I found her on the bathroom floor with an empty bottle of anxiety medication scattered around her, barely breathing, her lips already turning blue. I screamed for Elena while calling an ambulance, pumping her chest and breathing into her lungs like they taught in that CPR class I took years ago, begging her to stay with me while Elena prayed in Portuguese and English and languages I didn't recognize. The paramedics got there in 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours, pushing me aside to work on her, shouting medical terms I didn't understand while loading her onto a stretcher. At the hospital, they pumped her stomach and put her on machines while I sat in the waiting room covered in her vomit, replaying every sign I should have seen, every moment I should have known she was planning this. The doctor told us she'd taken enough pills to kill someone twice her size, but we'd found her just in time, and they were putting her on 24-hour suicide watch with someone in her room at all times. When she finally woke up the next day, she looked at me with empty eyes and whispered that she couldn't do it, couldn't sit in the courtroom and see Carlos again, that just thinking about his face made her feel like she was back in that warehouse with chains on her wrists. She grabbed my hand so tight it hurt, and begged me to understand that testifying would kill her just as surely as those pills, that she'd rather die than look at him across a courtroom and pretend to be strong. The prosecutor came to the hospital that afternoon with a different option, explaining that Maya could provide written testimony and recorded video depositions instead of appearing in person. It wasn't ideal for the case, he admitted, but it would protect her mental health and still give them evidence to use against Carlos and the others, and Maya nodded weakly from her hospital bed while the guard watched from his chair by the door. I spent the next 3 days watching Maya struggle with nightmares every time she tried to sleep, her body jerking awake whenever footsteps passed in the hallway, and that's when I knew we couldn't stay in Brazil for the trial. The embassy helped arrange our flights while Elena sat with us in the hospital room, holding Maya's hand and promising she'd be at every single court date to speak for her when she couldn't speak for herself. Maya just nodded and squeezed her aunt's fingers, too tired to say much of anything anymore. On our last night in Rio, the hospital let us go up to the roof garden for some fresh air, and we sat there under the stars using our old alien language like we were kids again, except now Zorblacks didn't mean pretending to be okay. It meant we survived when we shouldn't have. Maya whispered Gleep Glorp, which used to mean homework sucks, but now meant trauma sucks, and we both laughed even though nothing was funny. Dr. Lucia came to say goodbye on day 90, pressing a folder of referral letters into my hands for specialists in New York who could help Maya heal, and she hugged us both so tight I thought she might never let go, telling Maya her coded messages saved 12 other girls who were still out there. Detective Marcos showed up at the airport in a wheelchair with his arm still in a sling from where he'd been shot during the warehouse raid, insisting on personally escorting us through security because he wanted Maya to know her courage inspired him to keep fighting these cases no matter what. We were almost at the the gate when a man in a baseball cap approached us saying he had a message from Carlos. And before he could finish security, guards tackled him to the ground while he screamed that Carlos would never stop hunting us, that we'd destroyed everything and would pay for it. My hands shook the entire flight home while Maya stared out the window without speaking. And 5 days after landing in New York, she started an intensive PTSD program at Mount Sinai, while I enrolled in victim advocacy training because I needed to turn this nightmare into something useful. Her parents kept asking why she couldn't just move on and get back to normal, why she needed all this therapy when she was safe now, and I became the translator between them and their daughter, explaining that surviving isn't the same as being okay, that healing from this kind of trauma takes time they couldn't imagine. The other women who'd been rescued started a WhatsApp group using code names from our alien language, sending daily purple galaxies messages to remind Maya she wasn't alone, sharing their own struggles with nightmares and panic attacks and the long road back to feeling human again. 3 months into treatment, news came through Elena that they'd arrested The in a coordinated raid across 3 countries, and his laptop revealed trafficking operations in 12 nations with hundreds of victims, proving Maya's testimony through those video depositions had started an avalanche of investigations. 6 months after our escape, Elena sent a video from outside the courthouse in Rio, where Carlos's trial was finally beginning, the camera panning across hundreds of supporters holding signs with Blaosh written in purple marker, the alien word Maya had posted that meant "it's not over yet," now transformed into a rallying cry for justice. The prosecutor stood up with a stack of papers that had every single one of Maya's coded messages printed out, pointing at each word as he explained to the judge how Carlos had forced her to post happy updates while keeping her locked in that warehouse. I watched the live stream from my laptop in New York, my hands shaking as Carlos sat there in his orange jumpsuit, his lawyer trying to argue that the messages were just coincidences. The judge wasn't buying it. When the verdict came back 2 hours later, guilty on all charges, the courtroom erupted in cheers, and Carlos got 45 years without parole. The judge specifically said Maya's coded messages proved she was being held against her will the entire time, making it impossible for Carlos to claim she was there voluntarily. Over the next few months, the evidence from Maya's case led to 17 more arrests and convictions, with the warehouse being turned into a memorial center for trafficking survivors. Maya watched the verdict announcement from her therapist's office in New York, gripping my hand so tight I thought she might break my fingers. "Justice actually exists," she whispered, the first time she'd said anything positive about the legal system since her rescue. Thanks for letting me wonder through all of this with you. It's been a genuinely interesting ride sharing these moments. See you around. Subscribe for more content like this.